Ethan Carter was not your typical CEO. At just 29 years old, he had already built an empire, a tech startup that revolutionized data analytics for Fortune 500 companies. His name was whispered in boardrooms across Silicon Valley, often accompanied by awe and a tinge of envy. But behind the polished suits, the sleek office furniture, and the billion-dollar valuation lay a man who was, in many ways, profoundly disconnected from the world around him. The story begins not with a grand gesture or a dramatic event, but with something far quieter, a ticking sound. It's faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the hum of electricity running through wires. As the camera pans closer, we see it, a gold Rolex resting on a marble desk. Its hands move steadily, marking time with mechanical precision. Around it, the room is immaculate. Pristine white walls, minimalist decor, and a single laptop glowing softly under dim lighting. This is Ethan's sanctuary, his fortress against chaos. And yet, there's something unsettling about the way he sits there, hunched slightly forward, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as if they're afraid to commit to pressing any keys. His face tells the story better than words ever could. Ethan's expression is one of intense concentration, yes, but also discomfort. He shifts in his chair, adjusts his posture, then leans back abruptly as though trying to escape some invisible force pressing down on him. For those who know him well, or think they do, it's easy to dismiss these moments as quirks of genius. After all, isn't every visionary a little eccentric? But this isn't eccentricity, it's avoidance. Ethan has spent his entire life building barriers, constructing walls so high and thick that even he struggles to climb them sometimes. To truly understand Ethan, you'd need to rewind 2 decades to a suburban home where silence reigned supreme. Picture this: a young boy sitting alone at the dining table, his head buried in a textbook while his parents exchanged terse remarks about stock prices and quarterly reports. They weren't cruel people exactly, but their love language was achievement. Success wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. Failure was unthinkable. So Ethan learned early on to suppress emotions, to bury feelings beneath layers of logic and reason. If happiness couldn't be quantified, it didn't matter. If sadness slowed progress, it had no place in his life. As he grew older, Ethan became a master of compartmentalization. Emotions were filed away like documents in a drawer, neatly labeled and rarely revisited. Relationships, too, were approached with clinical detachment. Friends came and went, but none stayed long enough to leave. A mark, romantic entanglements, out of the question. Love, with its messy unpredictability, was a distraction he couldn't afford. Besides, physical touch, the kind most people take for granted, was something Ethan actively avoided. Not because he lacked opportunity, he certainly didn't, but because he had made a conscious decision never to engage in it, ever. This choice wasn't born out of fear or disgust, though outsiders might assume so. No, Ethan's aversion to touch stemmed from a deeper, more complex place. To him, human connection felt like a foreign concept, something others seemed to grasp instinctively, but which eluded him entirely. When classmates flirted during high school dances, he stood awkwardly against the wall, analyzing algorithms in his head instead of deciphering social cues. When colleagues slapped him on the back in celebration of a deal closed, he flinched, visibly retreating into himself until the moment passed. Over time, he convinced himself that touch was unnecessary, even detrimental. Why risk vulnerability when independence yielded such impressive results? Fast forward to the present day, and Ethan's life is a testament to self-sufficiency. Every aspect of his existence is meticulously planned and executed. His penthouse apartment is a marvel of modern engineering, equipped with voice-activated systems that eliminate the need for human interaction. Groceries are delivered weekly by drones. Even his wardrobe is curated by an AI stylist programmed to select outfits based solely on efficiency and professionalism. Outside work hours, Ethan immerses himself in hobbies that require neither companionship nor emotion: chess, coding challenges, reading dense nonfiction books about quantum physics. These activities provide structure, clarity, and most importantly, control. But control has its limits. Beneath the surface of Ethan's perfectly orchestrated life lies a simmering tension, a quiet desperation that threatens to boil over. Lately, cracks have begun to show. Sleepless nights punctuated by restless pacing. Moments of hesitation before sending emails, as if second-guessing decisions that once came effortlessly. And now, a new challenge looms on the horizon. A product launch unlike anything his company has attempted before. Dubbed Project Horizon, it promises to disrupt industries and cement Ethan's legacy as a tech pioneer. But success hinges on one critical factor: finding someone capable of managing the intricate logistics involved. Enter Claire Harper. Claire Harper wasn't just another name on Ethan's list of potential hires. From the moment her resume landed on his desk, courtesy of a glowing recommendation from one of his most trusted advisors, it was clear she was different. Her credentials were impeccable: an MBA from Stanford, years of experience managing high-stakes projects at Fortune 500 companies, and a reputation for turning chaos into order. But what truly set her apart were the intangibles, the qualities that couldn't be quantified on paper but spoke volumes about who she was as a person. Her first day at Carter Tech began like any other corporate initiation, a flurry of paperwork, orientation videos, and awkward introductions with HR representatives whose smiles felt rehearsed. Yet even amidst the monotony, Claire stood out. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, her posture straight but not rigid, her handshake firm without being overbearing. There was a warmth in her eyes that seemed almost out of place in the sterile environment of Ethan's headquarters. It wasn't forced or performative, it was genuine, the kind of authenticity that drew people in without them realizing why. When she finally stepped into Ethan's office for their initial meeting, the contrast between them was striking. Where Ethan exuded cold precision, his tailored suit, his calculated movements, his deliberate avoidance of eye contact, Claire radiated ease. She didn't fidget nervously or stumble over her words like so many others had before her. Instead, she greeted him with a calm smile and launched into a concise yet compelling pitch about how she intended to streamline operations for Project Horizon. Her voice was steady, her ideas innovative, and her passion undeniable. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself genuinely listening, not just hearing, but absorbing every word she said. Still, there was something about her presence that unsettled him. It wasn't anything overt, nothing he could pinpoint immediately. It was more subtle than that, like a faint vibration beneath the surface of a still pond. He noticed it when she leaned forward slightly during their conversation, her elbows resting lightly on the edge of his desk. Most people avoided encroaching on his personal space, instinctively sensing the invisible boundary he maintained around himself. But Claire either didn't notice or didn't care. And then there was the way she looked at him, not with admiration or intimidation, but with curiosity, as if she saw beyond the polished veneer he presented to the world and glimpsed the fractured pieces underneath. Their interaction ended with a curt nod from Ethan, followed by a terse, "You'll start Monday." To anyone else, his demeanor might have come across as dismissive, even rude. But Claire knew better. Beneath the stoic exterior, she sensed hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty that hinted at deeper complexities. She left his office feeling intrigued, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Perhaps it was the challenge of working for someone so enigmatic, someone whose brilliance was matched only by his emotional distance. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, something she couldn't yet put into words. Over the next few days, Claire immersed herself in the intricacies of Carter Tech. She spent hours poring over project timelines, financial reports, and employee evaluations, piecing together a comprehensive understanding of the company's inner workings. What struck her most, however, wasn't the data or the processes. It was the culture, or rather, the lack thereof. The office buzzed with activity, yes, but there was an undercurrent of detachment, a palpable absence of camaraderie. Conversations were transactional, interactions perfunctory. Even the break room, typically a hub of casual chatter in most workplaces, felt eerily silent. It didn't take long for Claire to realize that this atmosphere stemmed directly from the top. Ethan's leadership style was efficient, no doubt about that. Decisions were made swiftly, goals were met consistently, and innovation thrived under his guidance. But at what cost? Employees walked on eggshells around him, afraid to make mistakes or voice dissenting opinions. Collaboration was rare, replaced instead by siloed efforts driven by fear of failure. And while productivity metrics painted a rosy picture, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was missing. Her suspicions deepened during her first team meeting. Ethan presided over the gathering with clinical efficiency, rattling off updates and delegating tasks with machine-like precision. When one of the junior developers hesitated mid-presentation, stumbling over technical jargon, Ethan cut him off abruptly. "Clarify your points or move on," he said, his tone devoid of empathy. The developer flushed red, stammering an apology before rushing through the rest of his slides. Claire watched silently, her jaw tightening ever so slightly. Later, when she approached the young man to offer encouragement, he shrugged it off with a bitter laugh. "That's just how he is," he muttered. "Don't take it personally." But Claire did take it personally, not because she felt attacked, but because she recognized the toll such behavior took on morale. Leadership wasn't just about driving results. It was about inspiring people, fostering trust, and creating an environment where individuals felt valued. And based on what she'd observed so far, Ethan was failing miserably in that regard. Despite these concerns, Claire refused to let negativity cloud her judgment. If anything, the challenges ahead only fueled her determination to make a difference. She began implementing small changes, subtle shifts designed to humanize the workplace without disrupting its core functionality. She started leaving handwritten notes of appreciation on employees' desks, acknowledging their hard work and dedication. She organized informal coffee breaks, encouraging team members to connect on a personal level outside the confines of formal meetings. And whenever possible, she made a point of checking in with Ethan, not just about work-related matters, but about his well-being. At first, Ethan resisted these gestures. A cup of coffee placed beside his laptop elicited a raised eyebrow, but no verbal acknowledgement. A casual inquiry about his weekend plans was met with a curt, "busy," before he returned to typing furiously. But Claire persisted, undeterred by his aloofness. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, cracks began to form in his armor. One morning, after finding a thermos of tea waiting for him, she'd learned he preferred Earl Grey. He muttered a gruff, "Thanks." Another time, when she asked if he'd seen the latest SpaceX launch, a topic she knew interested him, he paused mid-stride and nodded briefly before offering a clipped, "Impressive technology." These moments may have seemed insignificant to outsiders, but to Claire, they were milestones. Each tiny breakthrough brought her closer to unraveling the mystery of Ethan Carter, peeling back layer after layer of the walls he'd built around himself. And though she couldn't have known it at the time, these incremental steps would pave the way for something far greater, a transformation neither of them could have anticipated. The first few weeks of Claire's tenure at Carter Tech were a delicate balancing act. On one hand, she was determined to prove her worth not just to Ethan, but to the entire team. Her reputation preceded her, and she knew that expectations were high. On the other hand, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that lingered in the air whenever Ethan was present. It wasn't hostility exactly, nor was it outright rejection. It was something subtler, more insidious, a quiet resistance that manifested in small, almost imperceptible ways. Take, for instance, the way Ethan handled meetings. Claire quickly learned that his approach was as methodical as it was isolating. He preferred email updates over face-to-face discussions, favoring bullet points and data tables over open-ended conversations. When he did convene with his team, it was always on his terms: precise start times, rigid agendas, and zero tolerance for deviation. For someone like Claire, who thrived on collaboration and creative problem-solving, this rigid structure felt stifling. But rather than chafe against it, she adapted, finding ways to inject moments of humanity into the otherwise sterile proceedings. One such moment occurred during a particularly grueling strategy session for Project Horizon. The team had been brainstorming solutions to a technical bottleneck that threatened to derail the launch timeline. Ideas flowed freely at first, but as the discussion dragged on, frustration began to mount. Voices grew louder, tempers flared, and progress stalled. Just as the meeting seemed poised to spiral into chaos, Claire spoke up. "What if we reframe the issue?" she suggested, her tone calm but firm. "Instead of focusing on what's going wrong, let's identify what's working and build from there." She grabbed a marker and stepped up to the whiteboard, sketching out a simplified version of the problem. Within minutes, the room shifted. Team members leaned forward, nodding in agreement, as Claire outlined a step-by-step plan to address the bottleneck. Even Ethan, who had been sitting silently in the corner with his arms crossed, uncrossed them and leaned slightly forward. By the end of the session, not only had they resolved the issue, but morale had improved significantly. Employees left the hobby's room buzzing with renewed energy, their confidence bolstered by Claire's leadership. Ethan, however, remained silent. He didn't congratulate her or acknowledge her contribution directly. Instead, he simply nodded curtly before excusing himself to return to his office. To anyone else, this might have seemed dismissive, but Claire noticed the slight softening in his expression, the brief flicker of admiration that crossed his face before he masked it with indifference. It was moments like these that made Claire question whether Ethan's aloofness was truly intentional, or if it was a defense mechanism born of years spent guarding himself against vulnerability. The more she observed him, the more convinced she became that there was more to his behavior than met the eye. And yet, every time she tried to probe deeper, he retreated further into himself. This dynamic reached a tipping point during a pivotal presentation to the company's board of directors. The stakes were high. Project Horizon represented not just a new product line, but a bold step into uncharted territory for Carter Tech. Success would solidify Ethan's status as a visionary leader, while failure could tarnish his reputation irreparably. As the day approached, tension mounted within the office. Employees worked late into the night, fine-tuning reports and rehearsing pitches. Claire, meanwhile, coordinated logistics, ensuring every detail was accounted for. On the morning of the presentation, everything seemed to be proceeding smoothly. Ethan delivered his opening remarks with characteristic poise, outlining the project's objectives and potential impact. Then came Claire's turn. Standing at the podium, she guided the board through a series of slides detailing the implementation strategy. Her delivery was confident, her arguments compelling. Just as she transitioned to the final segment, cost-benefit analysis, the projector malfunctioned, plunging the screen into darkness. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Board members exchanged uneasy glances, and several employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ethan, seated at the head of the table, clenched his jaw visibly. For a brief moment, panic threatened to take hold. But Claire didn't falter. Without missing a beat, she turned to the board and smiled reassuringly. "Technology can be unpredictable," she quipped, eliciting a few nervous chuckles. "But rest assured, the numbers speak for themselves." With that, she launched into an impromptu explanation of the analysis, using nothing but her voice and a laser pointer to guide the audience through the key figures. By the time IT managed to restore the projector, Claire had already won over the room. Applause erupted spontaneously, and even Ethan allowed himself a rare smile, a fleeting, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. Afterward, as the team celebrated their successful pitch, Ethan pulled Claire aside. "You saved us back there," he admitted, his voice low but sincere. It was the closest thing to gratitude she'd heard from him yet. Encouraged by this rare display of vulnerability, Claire decided to push a little further. "You know," she said casually, "moments like these remind me how important teamwork is. We're stronger together than we are apart." She paused, gauging his reaction. "I think your team would benefit from seeing more of that side of you, the side that trusts others, that values collaboration." Ethan stiffened immediately, his defenses snapping back into place. "My methods have served me well so far," he replied curtly. "There's no need to fix what isn't broken." And with that, He walked away, leaving Claire standing alone in the hallway. For a moment, she considered letting the matter drop. After all, challenging someone as entrenched in their habits as Ethan was risky business. But Claire wasn't one to shy away from challenges. If anything, this encounter only strengthened her resolve. She realized then that Ethan's resistance wasn't just about maintaining control. It was about protecting himself. Whatever walls he'd built around his emotions weren't just barriers to others. They were prisons of his own making. Over the following days, Claire began noticing subtle changes in Ethan's behavior. He still avoided direct interaction whenever possible, but there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when he seemed to soften. A lingering glance during a passing conversation, a hesitant nod of approval after a particularly insightful comment. These micro moments may have gone unnoticed by others, but to Claire, they were signs of progress. Signs that her presence was beginning to chip away at the fortress he'd constructed around himself. Still, the road ahead promised to be fraught with challenges. Ethan's defenses ran deep, rooted in years of conditioning and reinforced by countless layers of self-protection. Breaking through them would require patience, persistence, and perhaps a willingness to confront truths neither of them was fully prepared to face. The turning point in Ethan and Claire's dynamic came not with a single dramatic event, but through a series of small, incremental moments, each one building upon the last until the foundation of their relationship shifted irrevocably. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the first rays of dawn breaking over a dark horizon. These moments weren't planned or orchestrated. They simply happened, born out of necessity, curiosity, and an unspoken desire for connection that neither of them fully understood at the time. One such moment occurred late one evening, long after most employees had left the office. Claire had stayed behind to finalize a report for Project Horizon, her laptop glowing softly in the dim light of Ethan's otherwise empty floor. The silence was palpable, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of her fingers on the keyboard. She hadn't expected anyone else to still be there, so when she heard footsteps approaching, she glanced up in surprise. It was Ethan. He stood in the doorway of his office, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, a rare departure from his usual immaculate appearance. For a brief second, their eyes met, and Claire saw something unexpected in his gaze. Exhaustion. Not the kind brought on by a long day at work, but something deeper, more profound. It was as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders, invisible yet undeniable. "You're still here," he said, his voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant. "So are you," Claire replied with a faint smile. "Trouble sleeping?" Ethan hesitated before nodding slightly. "Something like that." There was an awkward pause, the kind that often precedes either retreat or revelation. Claire chose the latter. "Want to talk about it?" she asked gently, closing her laptop and turning her full attention to him. For a moment, Ethan looked as though he might refuse. His default instinct was always to withdraw, to shield himself from vulnerability. But something about Claire's tone, the sincerity in her voice, the genuine concern in her expression, stopped him. Instead of walking away, he stepped closer, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from her. "It's complicated," he admitted finally, his words measured but tinged with frustration. "This project, it's consuming everything. Every decision feels like it carries too much weight, every mistake magnified tenfold. And yet," he trailed off, staring at his hands as if searching for the right words. "And yet," Claire prompted softly. "And yet, none of it feels real," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent my entire life chasing success, building this company, proving myself. But sometimes I wonder, what's the point? Who am I doing all this for?" Claire listened intently, her heart aching for the man sitting across from her. In that moment, Ethan wasn't the untouchable CEO or the brilliant innovator. He was simply a person, flawed and fragile, grappling with questions that haunted him in the quiet hours of the night. She didn't offer platitudes or quick fixes. Instead, she shared a piece of herself. "I know how that feels," she said after a moment. "When my marriage ended, I spent months questioning everything, my choices, my worth, whether I'd ever find meaning again. It's isolating, isn't it? like no one else could possibly understand what you're going through. Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "You were married?" he asked, his tone betraying a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Briefly," Claire replied, with a wry smile. "We were young, idealistic, thought love would conquer all. Turns out, it doesn't fix much unless you're both willing to fight for it." She paused, her expression softening. "But even after it fell apart, I realized something important. Pain has a way of teaching us who we are, if we let it." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed, as though processing her confession. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a newfound vulnerability. "I don't think I've ever let myself feel pain," he admitted. "Not truly. I've always pushed it aside, buried it under work, achievements, distractions. But lately," he shook his head, unable to finish the thought. Claire nodded understandingly. "It's scary, isn't it? Allowing yourself to feel, to really feel, when you've spent so long avoiding it. But trust me, Ethan, it's worth it. Pain can be a teacher, but only if you listen." Their conversation stretched on for hours, weaving between topics both personal and professional. They discussed their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Ethan opened up about his parents' relentless pursuit of perfection, how it shaped his worldview and left him feeling perpetually inadequate despite his outward success. Claire, in turn, revealed the struggles she faced as a woman in a male-dominated industry, the constant pressure to prove herself worthy of respect. What started as a casual exchange evolved into something deeper, a mutual sharing of burdens that neither of them had anticipated. By the time they parted ways that night, both felt a sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted. For Ethan, it was the first time in years he'd allowed himself to be truly seen. For Claire, it was validation that her instincts about him were correct. Beneath the polished exterior lay a man yearning for connection, even if he didn't know how to seek it. Over the following weeks, their interactions became increasingly personal. What had once been strictly professional exchanges now included moments of genuine camaraderie. Claire continued to push Ethan gently, encouraging him to step outside his comfort zone without overwhelming him. She invited him to join her for coffee breaks, introducing him to colleagues he rarely interacted with. At first, he resisted, citing workload or scheduling conflicts, but gradually he began to relent, realizing that these small acts of engagement didn't diminish his authority. They humanized him. One particularly poignant moment occurred during a team outing organized by Claire. Determined to foster a sense of community within the company, she arranged a weekend retreat at a nearby lodge. Activities ranged from hiking and kayaking to group workshops designed to strengthen teamwork and communication. Ethan initially balked at the idea, dismissing it as frivolous, but Claire persisted, appealing to his logical side. "This isn't just about fun," she argued. "Studies show that teams perform better when they trust each other. Think of it as an investment in productivity." Reluctantly, Ethan agreed to attend, though he made it clear he wouldn't participate in anything overly social. True to his alles word, he kept to himself during the initial activities, observing from the sidelines as others laughed and bonded. But Claire had other plans. During a guided hike through the forest, she deliberately slowed her pace to match his, striking up a conversation about leadership styles. At first, Ethan responded tersely, clearly uncomfortable with the forced proximity. But as they walked, the rhythm of their steps sinking naturally, he began to relax. The dense canopy overhead muffled external noise, creating an intimate bubble where distractions faded away. "You know," Claire said thoughtfully, "the best leaders aren't afraid to show vulnerability. It inspires loyalty, fosters trust. People don't follow titles, they follow authenticity." Ethan frowned, considering her words. "Authenticity requires exposure," he countered, "and exposure invites judgment." "True," Claire conceded, "but it also invites connection. Isn't that what you want? For your team to believe in you, not just obey you?" Her question lingered in the air, unanswered, but not forgotten. By the end of the hike, Ethan found himself participating in a group photo. standing slightly apart but smiling nonetheless. It was a small victory, but for Claire, it represented progress. Back at the office, their bond continued to deepen. Claire introduced Ethan to mindfulness techniques, teaching him breathing exercises to manage stress. She encouraged him to take short breaks throughout the day, insisting that mental clarity was as important as physical stamina. Slowly but surely, Ethan began to embrace these practices, finding solace in moments of stillness he'd previously avoided. Yet, despite these advances, there remained one significant barrier neither of them had addressed directly: Ethan's aversion to touch. It loomed over their relationship like a shadow, unspoken but ever present. Claire sensed its significance, recognizing that confronting it would require delicacy and timing. So she waited, biding her time until the moment felt right. That moment arrived unexpectedly during a charity gala hosted by Carter Tech. The event was a lavish affair, attended by industry leaders, investors, and media personalities. As the face of the company, Ethan was obligated to make an appearance, mingling with guests and delivering a keynote speech. Claire accompanied him, serving as both moral support and buffer against unwanted attention. Throughout the evening, Ethan navigated the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries and fielding questions with characteristic poise. But beneath the surface, his discomfort was palpable. Every handshake, every pat on the back sent a jolt of tension coursing through him. Claire noticed, of course, and did her best to shield him from unnecessary contact. Then came the inevitable: a photographer requesting a posed photo with a prominent investor. The man extended his hand toward Ethan, expecting a firm grip and a smile for the camera. Ethan froze, his mask slipping momentarily as panic flickered in his eyes. Sensing his distress, Claire stepped in smoothly. "Let's capture the moment." "Without props," she suggested brightly, positioning herself between Ethan and the investor. "A candid shot always tells a better story." The photographer obliged, snapping a few quick photos before moving on. Ethan exhaled sharply, gratitude evident in his expression. Later, as they stood together on the balcony overlooking the city skyline, Claire broached the subject carefully. "That was close," she remarked lightly, sipping champagne. "Do you want to talk about it?" Ethan hesitated, his gaze fixed on the glittering lights below. "About what?" "Your reaction earlier to the handshake." He stiffened visibly, his defenses rising once more. "It's nothing," he muttered, turning away. "It's not nothing," Claire pressed gently. "Ethan, I've seen the way you recoil from physical contact. You don't have to explain it to me if you're not ready, but pretending it doesn't exist won't make it go away." Her words struck a nerve, forcing him to confront a truth he'd spent years denying. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "I've never touched a woman," he confessed. "Not intentionally, not willingly." Claire's breath caught in her throat, but she maintained her composure, meeting his gaze steadily. "Why?" she asked simply. Ethan shrugged, his shoulders sagging under the weight of unspoken memories. "It's complicated," he said again, echoing his earlier admission. "Fear, I suppose. Or maybe shame. I don't know. All I know is that it's easier to avoid it altogether." Claire reached out instinctively, placing a hand on his arm. He flinched reflexively, but to his credit, he didn't pull away. Instead, he stared at her hand as though it belonged to someone else, foreign, yet strangely comforting. "You don't have to figure it out alone," she said softly. "Whatever this is, whatever you're carrying, I'm here to help you through it." In that moment, something inside Ethan shifted. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to entertain the possibility of change, not because he believed it was possible, but because Claire made him believe in her. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough. The weeks following the charity gala marked a turning point for Ethan, not just in his personal journey with Claire, but also in the broader landscape of his professional life. While their relationship continued to evolve behind closed doors, external forces began to converge, threatening to upend the delicate balance Ethan had worked so hard to maintain. The pressures came from all sides: investors demanding transparency, media outlets speculating about his leadership style, and even whispers among employees who couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in their CEO's demeanor. For someone like Ethan, whose entire existence revolved around control, This influx of chaos felt suffocating. It started with a seemingly innocuous article in Tech Insider, one of the industry's most widely read publications. The piece was framed as a glowing profile of Carter Tech's meteoric rise under Ethan's leadership, but buried within its glowing praise were thinly veiled criticisms. The author questioned whether Ethan's lone wolf approach to management was sustainable, citing anonymous sources who described the workplace culture as cold and transactional. Worse still, the article hinted at rumors about Ethan's eccentric behavior, his aversion to social events, his reluctance to engage in casual conversation, and, most damningly, his apparent discomfort with physical contact. At first, Ethan dismissed the article as tabloid nonsense, unworthy of his attention. But when snippets of it began circulating online, accompanied by snarky comments and memes mocking his supposed aloofness, he couldn't ignore it any longer. Social media platforms lit up with hashtags like #TouchMeNotCEO and RoboBoss, turning what should have been a minor blip into a full-blown PR crisis. Employees exchanged nervous glances in the hallways, unsure how to address the situation. Even Claire, who prided herself on remaining unflappable, found herself grappling with unease. "This is bad," she admitted during a private meeting with Ethan, holding up her phone to show him screenshots of the viral tweets. "If we don't address this soon, it could damage your reputation and the company's." Ethan clenched his jaw, visibly irritated. "They're exaggerating trivial details," he snapped. "None of this matters. What matters is Project Horizon. If we deliver on time, none of this noise will stick," Claire sighed, leaning forward in her chair. "I understand where you're coming from, Ethan, but ignoring it won't make it. Go away. Perception shapes reality, especially in business. Right now, people are questioning your ability to lead, not because of your track record, but because of these rumors. We need to take action." Her words struck a nerve, though Ethan refused to admit it. Deep down, he knew she was right. The problem wasn't the rumors themselves, it was the underlying truth they exposed. His behavior, once dismissed as quirks of genius, was now being scrutinized under a harsh spotlight. And while he might have convinced himself that none of it mattered, the reality was far more complicated. Investors were watching closely, waiting for signs of instability. Competitors were circling, eager to exploit any perceived weakness. And worst of all, his own team, the very people he relied on to execute Project Horizon, were beginning to doubt him. Determined to regain control, Ethan instructed Claire to draft a statement addressing the allegations. He insisted it be brief, clinical, and devoid of emotion, a reflection of his usual communication style. But Claire pushed back, arguing that such an approach would only reinforce the stereotypes they were trying to dispel. "People want authenticity, Ethan," she said firmly. "A generic denial won't cut it. You need to humanize yourself, show them there's more to you than meets the eye." Reluctantly, Ethan agreed to compromise. Together, they crafted a carefully worded response, acknowledging the concerns raised in the article while reaffirming his commitment to leading with integrity. To soften the tone, Claire suggested including a personal anecdote, a story about overcoming adversity early in his career. It was a calculated risk, one that required Ethan to expose a sliver of vulnerability, but to his surprise, the strategy worked. The backlash subsided, replaced by cautious optimism from stakeholders who appreciated his willingness to engage openly. While the immediate crisis was averted, the incident left Ethan shaken. For the first time, he realized how precarious his position truly was. Success, he understood, wasn't just about delivering results, it was about perception, trust, and adaptability. And yet, adapting meant confronting aspects of himself he'd spent years avoiding. Each step forward felt like walking a tightrope, balancing progress against the fear of falling. Amidst these external pressures, Claire faced challenges of her own. Her growing closeness with Ethan hadn't gone unnoticed by others in the company, sparking speculation about the nature of their relationship. Some viewed her as a savior, the only person capable of reaching the enigmatic CEO. Others saw her as an opportunist, leveraging her proximity to climb the corporate ladder. The gossip stung, Not because it was entirely unfounded. Claire had developed feelings for Ethan, but because it undermined the genuine connection they shared. She wrestled with guilt, torn between her professional responsibilities and her personal desires. On one hand, she cared deeply about Ethan, wanting nothing more than to see him heal and grow. On the other hand, she feared crossing boundaries that could jeopardize both their careers. Their dynamic was already fraught with complexity. Adding romance into the mix would only complicate matters further. These conflicting emotions came to a head during a particularly tense week. Project Horizon was entering its final stages, requiring long hours and intense focus from everyone involved. Exhaustion permeated the office, tempers flared, and mistakes multiplied. Amidst the chaos, Ethan leaned heavily on Claire, relying on her guidance and support to keep things on track. She didn't mind, at least not initially. Helping him navigate challenges gave her a sense of purpose, reinforcing her belief in their partnership. But as the days wore on, cracks began to form. One evening, after yet another marathon session in the conference room, Ethan turned to Claire with an expression of gratitude mixed with something else, something softer, warmer. Before she could process it, he spoke. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he confessed, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "You've changed everything. For me, for the company. I owe you more than I can ever repay." Claire swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "You don't owe me anything," she replied softly. "This isn't about repayment, Ethan. It's about growth, for both of us." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ethan hesitated, his gaze lingering on hers for a moment. Too long? Then, as if snapping out of a trance, he looked away, clearing his throat awkwardly. "We should call it a night," he muttered, gathering his papers and retreating to his office. Claire watched him go, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. She wanted to confront him, to demand clarity about where they stood, but she knew better than to push too hard, too fast. Instead, she channeled her energy into self-reflection, examining her own motivations and fears. That night, unable to sleep, she sat alone in her apartment, staring out the window at the city lights. Her thoughts drifted to her ex-husband, a man whose insecurities had driven a wedge between them until their marriage crumbled beyond repair. She thought about the lessons she'd learned from that experience, the importance of setting boundaries, of protecting her heart while still allowing room for love. And she wondered whether Ethan, with all his complexities and contradictions, was worth the risk. The answer, she realized, wasn't simple. Loving someone like Ethan meant embracing uncertainty, accepting that healing wouldn't happen overnight or perhaps at all. It meant choosing faith over fear, hope over hesitation. And while the prospect terrified her, it also filled her with a strange sense of exhilaration, because despite everything, the walls he'd built, the secrets he guarded, she believed in him. She believed in the man he could become, if only he allowed himself to try. Meanwhile, Ethan grappled with his own inner turmoil. Claire's presence in his life had awakened emotions he'd long suppressed: admiration, affection, even longing. Yet these feelings terrified him almost as much as they intrigued him. Physical touch remained an insurmountable barrier, a reminder of the distance between them. How could he pursue a deeper connection when even the simplest gestures, holding hands, brushing shoulders, felt impossible? His confusion reached a breaking point during a therapy session arranged by Claire. Recognizing the toll his emotional struggles were taking on his mental health, she had gently suggested they seek professional guidance together. At first, Ethan resisted, dismissing therapy as unnecessary. But Claire persisted, framing it as a strategic investment in his leadership capabilities. Reluctantly, he agreed, though he entered the sessions with skepticism. The therapist, a seasoned psychologist named Dr. Margaret Hayes, wasted no time cutting through Ethan's defenses. During their third session, she posed a question that stopped him cold. "What are you afraid of, Ethan?" He blinked, caught off guard. "Afraid?" he echoed, his voice tinged with defensiveness. "I'm not afraid of anything." Dr. Hayes smiled knowingly. "Everyone is afraid of something. Fear is what keeps us stuck. So tell me, what's holding you back?" For a moment, Ethan considered deflecting, offering a vague response that would satisfy her without revealing too much. But then he glanced at Claire seated beside him, her expression encouraging yet non-judgmental. Something inside him shifted. "I'm afraid of losing control," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "of letting someone in and discovering they don't actually care, or worse, that they do, and I ruin it anyway." Claire's breath hitched, her heart aching for the man beside her. She reached out instinctively, placing a hand on his arm. This time, he didn't flinch. Instead, he stared at her touch, marveling at the warmth radiating through his skin. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was progress. As the session drew to a close, Dr. Hayes offered a parting thought. "Connection requires courage, Ethan. Not just yours, but Claire's as well. Trust takes time, but it starts with small steps. Are you ready to take the next one?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He simply nodded, his resolve strengthening with each passing second. Whatever lay ahead, whether triumph or failure, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't face it alone. The weeks following Ethan's therapy sessions marked a period of profound introspection, a time when the walls he'd spent decades constructing began to crumble under the weight of unspoken truths. Each session with Dr. Hayes peeled back another layer of his psyche, forcing him to confront memories and emotions he'd buried long ago. It was excruciating work, akin to excavating shards of glass embedded deep within his soul. Yet, despite the pain, Ethan found himself unable to turn away. For the first time in his life, he felt seen, not as a CEO, not as a prodigy, but as a person, and it terrified him. One particular session stands out, not because it was planned or anticipated, but because it unfolded organically, driven by the raw honesty that had begun to take root between Ethan, Claire, and Dr. Hayes. They were discussing trust, a topic that had dominated recent conversations, and how it related to Ethan's aversion to touch. Up until this point, Ethan had been guarded, offering only vague explanations about fear and discomfort. But today, something shifted. Dr. Hayes leaned forward slightly, her expression gentle yet probing. "Ethan," she began, "you've talked about your fear of losing control, of being vulnerable. Can you trace that fear back to its origin? When did it start?" Ethan hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously against the armrest of his chair. He glanced at Claire, who sat beside him, her presence both a comfort and a challenge. Her eyes met his, steady and encouraging, silently urging him to continue. Taking a deep breath, he spoke. "It started with my parents," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "They weren't cruel exactly, but they expected perfection. Every grade, every achievement. It wasn't enough unless it was flawless. Failure wasn't an option. And affection?" He paused, swallowing hard. "Affection was conditional. A pat on the back if I aced a test, silence if I didn't." Claire's heart ached for him, though she kept her expression neutral, knowing that interrupting might derail the moment. Dr. Hayes nodded thoughtfully, prompting him to continue. "As I got older, I realized that relationships, any kind of connection, required vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risking rejection. So I avoided it. At school, I focused on academics instead of friendships. In college, I threw myself into projects rather than parties. Even now, I structure my life around work because it's safe, predictable. Until Claire came along, I didn't think I needed anything else." His admission hung in the air, heavy with implication. Claire felt a lump rise in her throat, torn between pride at his courage and sorrow for the boy he once was, the boy who had learned too early that love came with strings attached. She reached out instinctively, placing a hand on his knee. This time, he didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he covered her hand with his own, his grip tentative but firm. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "for pushing me to face this." Claire smiled softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're stronger than you think, Ethan. Stronger than you've ever given yourself credit for." Their shared moment was interrupted by Dr. Hayes, who gently steered the conversation back to practical steps. "Progress isn't linear," she reminded them. "There will be setbacks, moments when old fears resurface, but what matters is how you respond. Are you willing to keep trying even when it feels impossible?" Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. "Yes," he said firmly. "I don't want to live like this anymore. I don't want to hide." With that declaration, the session ended, leaving both Ethan and Claire emotionally drained, yet strangely hopeful. Over the next few days, they worked together to implement small changes designed to bridge the gap between Ethan's intentions and actions. Claire introduced him to grounding techniques, teaching him to focus on physical sensations without judgment. They practiced mindfulness exercises during breaks, using breathing patterns to anchor themselves in the present moment. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Ethan began to lower his guard. But just as progress seemed within reach, a new crisis emerged, one that threatened to undo everything they'd accomplished. It started with a phone call from Carter Tech's board of directors. An anonymous investor had submitted a formal complaint questioning Ethan's leadership capabilities in light of the recent media scrutiny. The board requested an emergency meeting to discuss the company's future direction. Though Ethan tried to brush it off as routine bureaucracy, Claire recognized the gravity of the situation. If handled poorly, this could escalate into a full-blown leadership challenge. "You need to prepare," she told him later that evening, pacing anxiously in his office. "This isn't just about defending your position. It's about proving that you're capable of adapting, of evolving. You have to show them you're still the right person for the job." Ethan frowned, his frustration evident. "And how exactly am I supposed to do that? Pretend I'm someone I'm not?" "No," Claire replied sharply, stopping mid-pace to face him. "Be honest. Acknowledge the challenges you've faced and explain how you're addressing them. Show them that you're committed to growth, not just professionally but personally." Her words struck a chord, though Ethan resisted at first. Vulnerability had never been part of his leadership playbook. Admitting weakness felt like inviting disaster. But as the meeting approached, he realized he had no choice. His survival depended not on maintaining control, but on embracing change. The day of the meeting arrived, casting a pall of tension over the office. Employees exchanged nervous glances, aware of the stakes, but unsure of the outcome. Ethan, dressed impeccably, as always, exuded calm confidence as he entered the boardroom. Claire accompanied him, serving as both moral support and strategic advisor. Together, they faced a panel of stern-faced executives, each one armed with questions designed to expose flaws in Ethan's leadership. For nearly 2 hours, the interrogation continued, ranging from technical inquiries about Project Horizon to pointed critiques of Ethan's management style. Through it all, Ethan remained composed, answering each question with clarity and precision. But when the conversation turned to the recent media coverage, his demeanor shifted. Gone was the polished CEO. In his place stood a man grappling with his humanity. "I won't deny that I've made mistakes," he admitted, his voice steady, but tinged with emotion. "I've built this company on principles of innovation and efficiency, but in doing so, I neglected something equally important: connection. People aren't machines. They need empathy, understanding, trust. And while I may not have prioritized those qualities in the past, I'm learning to now, with help." He glanced briefly at Claire, whose presence bolstered his courage. "Change isn't easy, especially for someone like me, but I believe it's necessary, not just for my sake, but for the sake of this company. Because success isn't measured solely by profits or accolades. It's measured by impact, by the lives we touch and the legacies we leave behind." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Several board members exchanged glances, clearly moved by his candor. One by one, they voiced their support, acknowledging Ethan's willingness to grow as a leader. By the end of the Aussies meeting, the threat of removal had dissipated, replaced by cautious optimism about the path forward. Though the immediate danger had passed, the experience left Ethan profoundly shaken. Driving home that night, he reflected on the fragility of power, the precariousness of reputation. Success, he realized, wasn't a fortress. It was a bridge, constantly in need of reinforcement. And the strongest bridges were built on foundations of trust, not fear. When they arrived at his penthouse, Claire lingered in the doorway, unsure whether to stay or leave. Sensing her hesitation, Ethan spoke. "Stay," he said simply, his voice soft but firm. "Please," she nodded, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. They sat together on the couch, neither speaking nor moving, simply existing in the quiet aftermath of the day's events. After a while, Ethan broke the silence. "I couldn't have done it without you," he confessed, turning to look at her. "Not just today, but everything. You've changed me, Claire, in ways I never thought possible." Tears welled in her eyes, though she smiled through them. "You've changed too, Ethan, more than you realize." They sat there for a long time, the distance between them shrinking with each passing second. Finally, Ethan reached out, his hand hovering uncertainly above hers. With a deep breath, he closed the gap, his fingers brushing lightly against her skin. It wasn't perfect, his touch was hesitant, awkward, but it was real. And in that moment, something inside him shifted irrevocably. The days following Ethan's breakthrough at the board meeting marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just in his leadership journey, but in his personal evolution as well. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to imagine a future where connection wasn't something to be feared, but embraced. It was a daunting prospect, fraught with uncertainty, yet it filled him with a sense of possibility he hadn't felt in years. And at the center of this transformation stood Claire, whose unwavering support and patience became the anchor that steadied him through the turbulent waters of change. Their progress was slow and deliberate, each step forward requiring immense courage and trust from both parties. At first, Ethan's attempts at physical touch were clumsy and awkward, like a child learning to walk for the first time. He would hesitate before extending his hand, his fingers trembling slightly, as if unsure whether to proceed. When he finally did make contact, whether it was a tentative pat on the shoulder or a brief brush of fingertips, it was fleeting, almost imperceptible. But even these small gestures carried profound significance, representing milestones in a journey that once seemed impossible. Claire approached these moments with sensitivity and care, recognizing that pushing too hard might undo the fragile progress they'd made. Instead, she created opportunities for touch to occur naturally, weaving them into their daily interactions without making them feel forced. During meetings, she would casually rest her hand on his arm while pointing out key details on a report. On walks through the office, she would gently guide him by the elbow when navigating crowded hallways. Each instance was subtle, almost incidental, yet intentionally designed to desensitize Ethan to the discomfort he associated with physical contact. One particularly poignant moment occurred during a late-night strategy session for Project Horizon. The team had been working tirelessly to finalize the launch plan, and exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. Claire noticed Ethan rubbing his temples, a telltale sign of stress-induced tension headaches. Without saying a word, she retrieved a bottle of essential oil from her bag and motioned for him to sit down. "Let me help," she said softly, pouring a few drops onto her palms and warming them with a gentle rub. Before he could protest, she placed her hands lightly on either side of his head, massaging the oil into his temples with slow, rhythmic movements. Ethan stiffened initially, his body instinctively recoiling from the unfamiliar sensation. But as Claire continued, her touch firm yet soothing, he began to relax. His breathing slowed, his shoulders dropped, and for the first time in hours, the relentless hum of anxiety in his mind quieted. When she finally withdrew her hands, he opened his eyes and looked at her, gratitude evident in his expression. "That helped," he admitted, his voice tinged with surprise. "Thank you." Claire smiled warmly, her heart swelling with pride at the trust he was beginning to place in her. "Any time," she replied simply. "You don't have to carry everything alone, Ethan. Let me share the load." Her words resonated deeply, planting a seed of understanding that would continue to grow in the weeks to come. As Ethan became more comfortable with casual touches, Claire introduced increasingly intimate gestures, always gauging his reactions and respecting his boundaries. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, she suggested they practice hugging, a concept that initially terrified Ethan. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that," he confessed, his voice laced with apprehension. "What if I mess it up?" "You won't," Claire assured him, her tone gentle but firm. "And even if you do, it doesn't matter. What matters is the intention behind it. Just focus on how it feels, not how it looks." With that encouragement, they stood facing each other, their bodies rigid with anticipation. Claire extended her arms hesitantly, giving Ethan the option to retreat if needed. To her relief and his own, he mirrored her movement, wrapping his arms loosely around her waist. The embrace was awkward at first, their bodies stiff and unsure, but as seconds ticked by, something remarkable happened. Ethan exhaled sharply, his muscles relaxing as he leaned into the hug. Claire responded in kind, pulling him closer until their chests pressed lightly against each other. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Ethan closed his eyes, allowing himself to absorb the warmth radiating from Claire's body. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was real. And in that moment, he realized that touch wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be cherished. As their physical connection deepened, so too did their emotional bond. Conversations that once revolved around work and strategy began to shift toward more personal topics: dreams, fears, aspirations. Claire shared stories about her childhood, painting vivid pictures of summers spent exploring forests and winters curled up with books. Ethan, in turn, opened up about his teenage years, recounting the loneliness of high school dances and the frustration of feeling perpetually misunderstood. These exchanges weren't always easy. There were moments of vulnerability that left both of them raw and exposed, forcing them to confront insecurities they'd long buried. But through it all, they supported each other, offering solace and strength when it was needed most. Their relationship evolved into something neither had anticipated: less mentor-mentee, more partners in healing. Yet amidst these triumphs, challenges persisted. Progress was nonlinear, marked by setbacks as much as successes. Some days, Ethan regressed, retreating into old habits of avoidance and control. Other days, Claire struggled with doubts, questioning whether she was doing enough or too much to help him. But they weathered these storms together, drawing strength from their shared commitment to growth. A pivotal moment came during a weekend getaway Claire organized to celebrate the successful completion of Project Horizon. Determined to create lasting memories for the team, she rented a lakeside cabin and planned a series of activities designed to foster camaraderie and relaxation. For Ethan, however, the trip represented something far greater: an opportunity to test the boundaries of his newfound comfort with touch in a less formal setting. On the second day, the group gathered around a bonfire, sharing laughter and stories under a canopy of stars. Claire sat beside Ethan, her shoulder brushing lightly against his as they listened to colleagues recount humorous anecdotes. At one point, a gust of wind sent a chill through the air, prompting Claire to pull a blanket from her bag and drape it over their laps. Without thinking, Ethan reached out and tucked the edge of the blanket around her legs, his hand lingering briefly on her knee. The gesture was simple, almost reflexive, yet it carried profound meaning. Claire turned to look at him, her eyes shining with admiration and affection. "See?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "You're getting there." Ethan nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Because of you," he replied softly. Later that night, as the group dispersed and the embers of the fire glowed faintly in the darkness, Ethan and Claire lingered behind, savoring the quiet intimacy of the moment. They talked about the future, about the possibilities that lay ahead. Now that Ethan had begun to dismantle the walls he'd built around himself, Claire expressed her belief in his potential, not just as a leader, but as a person capable of forming meaningful connections. Ethan, in turn, acknowledged the role she had played in his transformation, thanking her for her patience and perseverance. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me something I didn't think I deserved, a chance to start over." Claire reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You deserve it, Ethan, more than you realize." Their conversation stretched on for hours, weaving between reflections on the past and dreams for the future. By the time they retired to their respective cabins, both felt a renewed sense of purpose, a belief that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they could face them together. The calm that had settled over Carter Tech in the wake of Project Horizon's success was short-lived. Just as Ethan and Claire began to find their rhythm, both personally and professionally, a new storm brewed on the horizon, threatening to upend everything they had worked so hard to build. It came in the form of an unexpected offer, a buyout proposal from Titan Tech, one of the largest and most influential conglomerates in the tech industry. At first glance, the deal seemed too good to refuse. Titan Tech offered a staggering sum, enough to make every employee at Carter Tech an overnight millionaire, and promised access to resources and networks that could propel the company to unprecedented heights. For many CEOs, such an opportunity would have been a dream come true, but for Ethan, it represented something far more complex, a crossroads between the life he had meticulously constructed and the uncertain future he was beginning to envision with Claire by his side. The offer arrived via email late one evening, its subject line innocuous, yet loaded with implication: proposal for strategic partnership. Ethan read it twice, his brow furrowing as he processed the implications. On paper, the numbers were undeniable: billions of dollars, global reach, limitless potential. Yet beneath the polished language and carefully crafted promises lay a question that struck at the core of who he was. What did he truly want? Claire found him sitting alone in his office, the email open on his laptop screen, his expression unreadable. She knocked lightly on the doorframe before stepping inside, her presence immediately drawing his attention. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone gentle but probing. Ethan hesitated, torn between sharing the news and keeping it to himself. Finally, he gestured for her to sit. "Titan Tech wants to buy us out," he said simply, his voice devoid of emotion. "They're offering, well, let's just say it's more money than I ever imagined." Claire's eyes widened slightly, though she quickly masked her surprise. "That's incredible," she replied cautiously. "What are you thinking?" "That's the problem," Ethan admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to think. Part of me sees this as the ultimate validation, a chance to secure my legacy, to ensure everyone here is taken care of. But another part," he trailed off, his gaze dropping to the desk. "But another part?" Claire prompted softly. "Another part feels like it's selling out," he confessed, his voice tinged with frustration. "Like I'm giving up control, abandoning everything I've built. And then there's you." Her breath caught at the mention of her name, though she maintained her composure. "Me?" she echoed, her tone neutral. "You've changed me, Claire," he continued, his words spilling out in a rush. "You've shown me that success isn't just about numbers or accolades. It's about connection, impact, growth. If I take this deal, what happens to all of that? What happens to us?" The weight of his admission hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Claire reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "This isn't about me, Ethan," she said firmly. "It's about you, about what you want, for yourself, for your team, for the future. But you're part of that future," he insisted, his voice cracking slightly. "Aren't you?" She smiled faintly, her heart swelling with affection despite the gravity of the moment. "Yes," she admitted, "but only if it's what you truly want, not because you feel obligated, not because you're afraid of losing me. You need to decide based on what aligns with your values, your vision." Her words resonated deeply, planting a seed of clarity amid the chaos swirling in Ethan's mind. Over the next few days, he wrestled with the decision, weighing the pros and cons with meticulous precision. He consulted with advisors, analyzed market trends, and even sought input from trusted colleagues. Yet no amount of data or deliberation could provide the answer he sought. Ultimately, the choice came down to something far more intangible: trust. On the morning of the deadline, Ethan called an emergency meeting with the board of directors. Claire accompanied him, serving as both confidant and sounding board as he prepared to deliver his verdict. The room buzzed with anticipation, each member eager to hear whether Carter Tech would remain independent or join forces with Titan Tech. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that silenced the chatter. "I've spent my entire career chasing success," he began, his gaze steady as it swept across the room. "Building this company from the ground up, proving myself to the world. And while I'm proud of what we've achieved, I've come to realize that success isn't defined solely by profits or acquisitions. It's defined by impact, the lives we touch, the legacies we leave behind. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. Titan Tech's offer is generous, no doubt about that. But accepting it would mean sacrificing something far more valuable: our independence, our identity, our ability to innovate without compromise. And frankly, I'm not ready to give that up. Not yet. The room erupted into murmurs of surprise and admiration, though Ethan barely registered them. His focus remained fixed on Claire, whose eyes glistened with pride as she nodded in silent approval. When the meeting adjourned, several board members approached him to express their support, reinforcing his belief that he had made the right decision. Later that evening, Ethan and Claire stood together on the rooftop terrace of his penthouse, overlooking the city skyline bathed in the golden glow of sunset. The air was crisp, carrying with it a sense of renewal and possibility. "You did the right thing," Claire said softly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Not just for the company, but for yourself." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "Part of me wanted to take the safe route, to lock everything away again. But then I thought about what you said, that success is about impact. And I realized I want to keep building something meaningful with you." Her heart skipped a beat at his words, though she tempered her response with a playful smile. "Well, you're stuck with me now," she teased, "whether you like it or not." He chuckled, pulling her closer until their bodies aligned. Their embrace was no longer hesitant or awkward. It was confident, natural, a testament to how far they'd come. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from uncertainty. He was embracing it, trusting that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The days following Ethan's decision to reject Titan Tech's offer marked a new beginning, not just for Carter Tech, but for Ethan and Claire as well. Their shared victory over external pressures had strengthened the bond between them, transforming what was once a professional collaboration into something far deeper and more profound. Yet, as they stood on the precipice of this uncharted territory, both were acutely aware of the complexities that lay ahead. For Claire, the question wasn't whether she cared about Ethan, it was how much she dared to let herself care. She had spent years rebuilding her life after her failed marriage, learning to set boundaries and protect her heart from unnecessary pain. Falling for someone like Ethan, a man whose emotional scars ran as deep as his brilliance, felt like stepping into unknown waters. Could she risk opening herself up again, knowing that his journey toward healing was still ongoing? For Ethan, the stakes were equally high. He had spent decades constructing walls around his emotions, convinced that vulnerability was a weakness to be avoided at all costs. But Claire had shown him otherwise. She had proven that connection, however messy and unpredictable, was worth pursuing. The challenge now was balancing his newfound desire for intimacy with the lingering fears that threatened to pull him back into isolation. Their conversations during this period reflected these internal struggles, oscillating between moments of clarity and uncertainty. One evening, as they sat together in Ethan's office after hours, the topic inevitably arose. "What happens next?" Claire asked, her voice soft but probing. "For us, I mean." Ethan hesitated, his fingers tracing absent patterns on the surface of his desk. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Part of me wants to rush forward, to define what we are, where we're going. But another part, it's scared, Claire. Scared of ruining what we've built." She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "We've come so far," she said thoughtfully, "and I don't want to lose that. But rushing into something, whether it's romantic or otherwise, might do more harm than good. We need to give ourselves time to grow, individually and together." Her words resonated deeply, offering a path forward that honored both their needs and limitations. They agreed, then and there, to keep things platonic for now. It wasn't a rejection of their feelings. Rather, it was an acknowledgement that their connection was too precious to jeopardize by moving too quickly. Instead, they would focus on nurturing the foundation they had built: trust, respect, and a shared commitment to personal growth. But even as they made this decision, Ethan surprised Claire with a gesture that spoke volumes about how far he had come and how much he valued her presence in his life. It happened during a company-wide meeting to celebrate the successful launch of Project Horizon. Employees filled the auditorium, buzzing with excitement as Ethan took the stage to deliver a speech. His words were heartfelt, thanking the team for their hard work and dedication. But it was the final announcement that left everyone, including Claire, speechless. As many of you know, Ethan began, his gaze sweeping across the room before settling on Claire. Claire Harper has been instrumental in guiding this company through some of its most challenging moments. Her leadership, creativity, and unwavering support have not only ensured our success, but have also inspired me personally to become a better version of myself. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in before continuing, which is why I'm thrilled to announce that Claire will be stepping into a new role as co-founder and partner of Carter Tech. This isn't just a promotion, it's a recognition of the invaluable impact she has had on this organization and on my life. The room erupted into applause, but Claire barely registered it. Her eyes locked with Ethan's, tears streaming down her face as she processed the magnitude of his gesture. It wasn't just a professional milestone, it was a declaration of trust, a symbol of the partnership they had forged through adversity and triumph alike. After the meeting, Claire found Ethan waiting for her outside the auditorium. Without saying a word, she threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly. For the first time, the embrace felt effortless, natural, unguarded. When she finally pulled back, her smile was radiant. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I did," Ethan replied firmly. "Because you deserve it. Because we deserve it." Their shared moment was interrupted by cheers from passing employees who clapped and whistled in celebration. Ethan and Claire laughed, the sound light and genuine, as they walked side by side toward the elevators. Though their relationship remained undefined, there was no doubt about one thing: they were partners, in every sense of the word. As the weeks turned into months, Carter Tech flourished under their joint leadership. Together, they implemented initiatives designed to foster a culture of empathy and innovation, proving that success and humanity could coexist. Employees thrived in an environment where their contributions were valued not just for their outcomes, but for the people behind them. For Ethan and Claire, the journey was far from over. There were still challenges to face, fears to confront, and dreams to pursue. But they faced them together, drawing strength from the bond they had cultivated through patience, perseverance, and trust. In the end, their story wasn't about perfection, it was about progress, about two individuals who, despite their flaws and fears, chose to believe in the possibility of change. And as they stepped into the future, hand in hand, they carried with them the knowledge that true success wasn't measured by accolades or achievements, but by the connections they forged along the way. The camera pans out slowly, capturing Ethan and Claire walking down a bustling hallway in Carter Tech. The energy around them is electric. Employees greet them warmly, projects hum with activity, and laughter echoes through the corridors. They exchange a glance, their expressions mirroring a quiet confidence and mutual admiration. As they enter a conference room filled with eager faces, ready to tackle the next big challenge, the screen fades to black. A single line of text appears. Sometimes, the greatest victories aren't the ones we achieve alone, but the ones we share. The video ends with a call to action. If you enjoyed this story of transformation and connection, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring journeys. Together, we can redefine what it means to succeed.